Hey everybody, JJ Cooper, Geoff Pontes back. Another of these State of the Organization podcasts. We are looking, another prospects podcast as we dive in today to the NL Central. If you haven't enjoyed any of these up to now, we've already rolled out the entire American League. We've rolled out the NL East. The NL West will come tomorrow. We're rolling that as well. So we hope you're enjoying these. But what we're going to do today, the trade deadline is over. The draft signing deadline is over. These systems are a little bit more static than they've been for quite a while now. And so we're kind of just looking at where farm systems are, where the big league club is, how does that all tie together? And Geoff, when I look at the NL Central, I feel like this remains a pretty interesting division, both at the big league level and kind of where this is going to go, because I do think there are some farm systems here that are quite talented. And I do think that there's a lot of, this is a division where there's a lot of teams who kind of, you can make plausible cases for them in 2025, 2026. It's not one of those divisions where you say, okay, well, the same teams are probably going to be the same teams year in, year out.
Yeah, I would say like the future of this division is maybe more wide open than just about any division in baseball. And it could very quickly become the best division in baseball if things click the right way for a lot of these organizations, because we're going to talk about it today. You do have 3 to 4 really strong farm systems within this division. You have some of the most exciting young players in the game. I would argue you have the most exciting young position player in the game in Elly De La Cruz. The Pirates have the most exciting young pitcher in the game. I don't.
Do you need to say Paul? Or does everyone just know that?
I don't think I need to say Paul Skeens. I think everyone kind of knows immediately. The Cubs have a nice, youngish core and a pretty stacked farm system of players that are fairly close to the major leagues, a bunch of them that are in AAA. The Cardinals have consistently produced at least a few interesting players out of their farm system. And the Brewers are a good team at the major league level. They're running away with the division at the moment. And they have a pretty talented farm system as well, and some really exciting young major league players and guys like Jackson Chourio, et cetera. So I think you can look at this division and say, over the next 2 to 3 years, just the way things play out, this could be the best division in baseball, because you could have 5 pretty competitive teams if everything breaks the right way. Obviously, there's always luck in these equations with these sort of things, but this is a really talented division, and it's a fairly young, exciting division. Some teams that a couple of years ago, you were not, 2022, you weren't tuning in to Pirates games. You weren't tuning in to Reds games. I think that's changed a lot. That it was really always the Cardinals were kind of the class of the division, and the Brewers right there behind them. Things have changed a lot more over the last couple of years. And of course, you had the Cubs. So it's interesting to see how this is going to play out. Some smaller market teams, but smaller market teams with really good players under control for a long time and good farm systems to back it up.
If I know Brewers fans are going to yell at me for even bringing this up, because if you're a Brewers fan, you know this, but for someone who's not paying attention, since June 1st, we're recording this on after the games of August 11th. Since June 1st, Jackson Chourio is hitting 318, 365, 513. That's 54 games. So, yeah, Jackson Chourio's been, after a little bit of an acclimation process, Jackson Chourio's pretty much been everything that you could kind of hope Jackson Chourio could be, especially when you throw out the fact that, oh, yeah, by the way, he's 20. So there's a lot to love here about what he's doing and what the Brewers are doing. But we're going to go, as we've been doing on all these, we're going to go in alphabetically, which starts us off with an organization that you do our top 30 for, Geoff. Like, when I look at the Cubs, I would say at the big league level this year, it's been a little bit disappointing. I thought a little bit more, they've been kind of that one of those hovering around 500 teams. They still could make a run. This is this is the National League. I wouldn't say that they're completely out of it by any stretch of the imagination with the 3 wild cards now and all, but they kind of made moves, I would say, at the deadline that were as much designed to help them in the long term as they were in the short term. I think we both really like what they got in Isaac Paredes, or at least I do. Don't want to speak for you, but the thing that does jump out to me about this Cubs team is I still really like this farm system. Not everyone has had a great season on the minors. Cade Horton's injuries really are kind of the dismaying fact of his season. But I look at this farm system, and even after some graduations, even after getting a very good, by the way, good trade by them for Michael Bush, kind of freed him up to be a very useful addition for them. But how do you kind of see the state of this farm system as we head on into 2025 and beyond?
Yeah, I think you can look at the top of this farm system, and it's pretty clear this is one of the more talented top tens that we have. I think you look at, a handful of top 100 prospects here, and Horton, Shaw, Owen Casey, Jefferson Rojas, Kevin Alcantara, Moises Ballesteros is a top 100 prospect. You have James Triantos, who was off the top 100, probably makes his way back onto the top 100. And then a couple of interesting draft picks, in Cam Smith at 8. Cole Mathis is down at 12, a player that I really like, the two-way player in college that I think will be a pretty interesting power hitting first baseman. And then you have, an international signing like Fernando Cruz, who got, $4 million last year. So sort of an interesting farm system that has a variety of prospects, but a lot of it is position heavy. It's Cade Horton at the top. Unfortunately, he's kind of had a lost year with injuries, etc. But the rest of it is really heavily position players. And I think the biggest question for Cubs fans and the organization is the only guy that is hitting free agency next year is Kyle Hendricks. And I don't think that's a major loss.
They'll be okay.
They'll be all right with Kyle Hendricks at this point, either going into retirement at 35 or, trying to pitch elsewhere. But the entire lineup is 30 years of age or younger. The 30-year-olds they have are Ian Happ, who's still under contract for a few more years, Seiya Suzuki, who's still under contract for a few more years, and Dansby Swanson. People forget Cody Bellinger's still 29. This is a really good young team at the major league level. And it's going to be a matter of where do we find opportunities for Shaw and Casey and Alcantara, Ballesteros, and Triantos, over the next year to 18 months, because all of these guys over that course of time are going to be major league ready. And there's a lot of guys here that provide a lot of different things, right? Just in terms of you have more of a hit tool guy with some power in Shaw. You have kind of a straight hit tool guy in Triantos that's shown some speed in the bases this year. A lot of that is instincts. A tool monster in Alcantara, a power monster in sort of Owen Casey, a toolsy lower level up the middle shortstop in Jefferson Rojas, who has really good plate skills, and then Moises Ballesteros, who I think both of us were sort of surprised. He gets a lot of body shaming. I think we were both surprised at what the body looked like in person at the Futures game. That this guy wasn't Alejandro Kirk. This wasn't like a really unusual round body where you kind of wonder, like, is he going to stick behind the plate? It's a little bit more like Francisco Alvarez. And then when you watch his batting practices, they were pro batting practices. This is like what your high school coach wants you to do. Use the whole field, show a little bit of power, hit line drives all over the place. His barrel control of anybody that we saw across those batting practices, and there's probably few people who watch the Futures game batting practice in the manner in which we do, where we mark down all the balls and we're looking at who's hitting it the hardest. And he really showed elite barrel control. And I think you can look at the numbers and how quickly he's moved. And he's never really struggled in terms of, the hitting side of things. Maybe the power isn't 30 home run power, but he's a guy that takes what the pitcher gives him. He's always going to hit. He's always going to get on base. It's a really interesting mix of players. I don't know if all these guys matriculate up to the major leagues with the Cubs, but I think you can look at this system and say, hey, they have a lot of talent. They have pieces that they could trade. It's a matter of picking the right guys, to fill roles in Chicago in the future versus the guys that you package together to get a pitcher or whatever it is, or upgrade at a position. They have the ability to do that. And they have some interesting depth. It's not the deepest system that we're going to talk about, but there's, a wide variety of different archetype of pitchers, some guys who could potentially be starters, but more back end depth type of guys, a bunch of different interesting relief arms with stuff. And And then, sort of a handful of players that have hit in the minor leagues that you have some questions about how they fit in the majors. A guy like Matt Mervis, Louis Vasquez, BJ Murray, even Pablo Aliendo, who's hit a lot in the minor leagues, and Hayden McGarry.
Alexander Canario.
Yeah. And Brendan Davis has had somewhat of a bounce back season after being one of the top prospects in the game and falling off the top 30 at points this over the last year, just because of how bad things have got. Yeah. And then a guy in Brett Bateman, who's kind of an underrated hit tool, fourth outfielder type that I know, a lot of models like. So it's an interesting system. Maybe not the most tooled up system outside of the top 10, but there's a lot of pieces here. I think this is, if we factored in depth more to, our rankings, they might move up a spot or two. But I think they were top 5, top 6, somewhere in that range.
So I do want to clean one thing. Bellinger is on a 3-year deal, but it does have player opt-outs. So it is possible that he will be a free agent at the end of this year. He has to decide whether he's willing to come back for $30 million for next year, or whether he wants to take another swing at free agency. So he could be someone else who could leave. I did want to ask you along those lines. I think the other question they have to figure out, which is a guy who has graduated now, but is P. Crow Armstrong, who can steal bases like almost nobody else and can play defense at an exceptional level in center field. Now the question is going to be, and he's 22, I think you give him a long runway next year to show this, but can he hit enough to make that work? I mean, that's kind of, I think, the question, because so far in the big leagues, there hasn't been a whole lot of power at all, and he's not hitting for average, which means he's not getting on base either. He's kind of, right now, I would describe him as, you bet him 8th or 9th and say he can run, he can play defense. But as you lay out, they've got so many guys coming up behind him that's going to make him a 4th outfielder down the road unless something improves. I mean, what's your kind of sense on PCA?
Yeah, I think we kind of internally have always questioned how much he would hit and, what it would look like at the major league level. There's been some improvements over the last month or so. It's still not a ton. But he is a guy that, provides you elite defense in center field. The numbers sort of bear that out. I mean, he's been a 1-WAR player while hitting 212, 254, 341 because his defensive metrics and his ability in center field is so strong. I think he's been a little lucky that Bellinger has been beat up this year and, has primarily been a DH because that probably would be where he would slot in. But I think you can kind of look at a similar type of player, though he wasn't ranked quite as high, but was a top 100 prospect at points in Boston, in Ceddanne Rafaela. Ceddanne Rafaela really struggled over his first 2 months of the season. Since June 1st, he's been one of the best offensive players in that team. He's hitting well over 300. He's hitting for power now. He's had some big moments, some big hits. Of course, he has the ability to play shortstop and center field, so that gets him in the lineup a little bit more. But an elite center fielder. And I kind of wonder if they can look at that track record with PCA and say, hey, he's never going to be, a plus offensive player, but he can maybe get to league average, with some adjustments. Now that he's seen it, it does take some time. We've seen this even with the best prospects to sort of adjust to major league pitching. The gap between AAA and the majors has never been higher. It wouldn't shock me if he was packaged with some of those prospects for another player. I can't say what the deal would be. But it also wouldn't shock me if they go into the opening day next year with him as their starting center fielder and see how things go offensively at the plate. I don't think it's a lost cause. There is enough offense there, but it's similar to Raphael in the sense that, like, he doesn't have big walk rates to fall back on. The power is sort of comes and goes. Like, he'll go on hot streaks where he will hit for some power. But the speed is there. There's tools. It's just a matter of if they, as an organization, think he fits the timeline long term. I think he can probably get to an average level. I don't think he's ever going to be, putting up outrageous seasons that, make him a standout offensive player. That's certainly not something that I would necessarily place my bets on.
Right. They did have similar, I do think that I feel like Raphael has a little bit more power. I know that the metrics don't necessarily agree with that. They would say that they're more similar than I'm putting it. But that is kind of, I guess, the hopeful position for them. And I would say also the other thing that does stand out with the Cubs, to their credit, compared to where the Cubs were at their peak, almost a decade ago now. Starting pitching, Justin Steele has developed into a very solid starter. They've gotten that was a very astute signing with Shota Imanga. I butchered his name. My apologies. But Javier Assad, like, this is a team that they don't need Cade Horton to hurry to the big leagues next year at the start of the year because they don't have any pitching. This is a team that actually has a nice pickup in Ben Brown. They've just done a really good job of kind of building a solid pitching staff, which has really kind of been one of their weaknesses over the years. So this does feel like a team that we would say is trending up. I would expect them to be better next year than they were this year. I would expect them to be better in 26 than they were in 25 potentially. So there's a lot to like here. It puts them in a good spot, even if it kind of hasn't had been the breakout season in 2024, which I don't think thought it was a slam dunk that it was going to be the case, but that hasn't been the case. I think you could kind of say the same thing. Take everything I just said. You could probably say the same thing about Cincinnati Reds. As you noted, and kind of on our intro, that this is a team that has one of the best young players in baseball. Elly De La Cruz is one of, if not the most exciting player. Royals fans can rightfully argue, hey, Bobby Witt Jr., plays shortstop also, hits for power, going to win a batting crown in the AL, all these things. You can make that argument too. But one of the most exciting players in baseball at a very young age, where you would say the next 5 years for Elly De La Cruz should just keep getting better and better and better. They have a young homegrown rotation who, when everyone's healthy, Hunter Green has kind of emerged, I would say, into a true front of the rotation starter, especially as we got to June, July, August this year. Nick Lodolo, when healthy, is really good. This is a team that has a young rotation, has had some injuries this year. But then I would say also the kind of, if there is a frustrating point, they haven't broken through at the big league level. They haven't taken that next step from where they were last year. They've kind of been a team that hovers above, really at, and then a little bit below 500 for most of the year. But then when you look at the farm system, Jeff, I would say that this is a year where you would say there's been a lot of frustration, and not because, all these players have fallen on their face, but more of like, Alfredo Duno's been hurt. Edwin Arroyo's been hurt. They have had a couple of pitchers. Connor Phillips was in the rotation at the end of the year last year, and then it all kind of fell apart for him this year with his control, and he had to be sent back to the complex to kind of try to get put back together. Ty Floyd, who was one of their top draft picks last year out of LSU, hasn't pitched all year. He's out for the year with shoulder surgery. And Hunter Holland, was another guy from their last year's draft, has missed most of the time year with injuries. Leo Balcazar, who was coming back from a pretty significant knee injury, has struggled, is just starting to put it back together. So there's been a lot of, I would say, like Noelvi Marte, who was on their preseason, was a top 100 prospect preseason, missed the first 80 games this season with a PED suspension. There's been a lot of buts with this team. But when I look at it, for all those buts, I still like the farm system. I think a combination of Chase Burns and Rhett Lauder to add to what is already a very homegrown and young rotation is really exciting. Throw in a Chase Petty to that as well. And I do think that there are some bats here, maybe not at that superstar type level, more of the solid contributor type, but it's a nice mix to me, even if I would say that the 2024 minor league season has been more disappointing than promising at the minor league level for the Reds.
Yeah, and I think this is a system that you can go well into the 20s and find players that have upside that you like, and even some guys that had some prep pedigree, some draft pedigree that maybe didn't have the best seasons, like a Mike Sirota, a Peyton Stovall, who coming out of high school was kind of mentioned on a day one track. Didn't sign, went to Arkansas, didn't hit as much as people thought he would. With pro development, you don't know if he takes a step forward. Reese Hines, we saw what the outlandish power was for short spurts this year in the major leagues. Zach Maxwell and Tristan Smith, different types of pitchers, but guys that have really interesting stuff. And there's some athletes mixed in, some interesting international players who could take a step forward. It's a really deep top 30. I think you would say after the top 2 or 3, it kind of goes down in quality a little bit. They don't have that 6, 7, 8 player sort of mix that you do see with the Cubs. But there's still a handful of guys here, like Edwin Arroyo and Cam Collier, who have been top 100 prospects. Blake Dunn is a really interesting athlete. I think is maybe better than we probably rate him as or think he is. There's just a lot of tools there and stuff that he could potentially do well. You can look at this system and see a lot of different major leaguers. And then the best part is, in terms of their expiring contracts, it's nobody of substance. It's guys at the back end of the bullpen, like, Buck Farmer or, Jacob Junis and names like that, Emilio Pagan. Like, there's just less concern. I think Nick Martinez can opt out this year, who's had a pretty good role for them this year, but is 34 years old. And, I don't think, is going to make or break their future. And as you said, you can look at Hunter Green, Nick Lodolo, Andrew Abbott, and then slot in Chase Burns to that at some point soon. Slot in Rhett Lauder to that to some point soon. And you have a really exciting homegrown rotation with some runway in terms of control and part of this organization for the foreseeable future. And then you mix in this, when healthy, they didn't even have enough spots for all the potential full-time regulars that they had, because they've missed Christian Encarnacion-Strand. Matt McClain has missed most of the season. And it was a question of, like, Jonathan India. And India's responded with, one of his better offensive seasons this year. I think you can argue arguably his best season since his rookie year. He still hasn't kind of reached those heights. He's kind of tipped down a little bit of late, but still a pretty good player, and maybe a piece for them that still has a couple years left, who's only 27 years old. It's kind of an exciting overall organizational depth. Maybe the system itself doesn't rank as highly as it used to, but you look at the major league all the way down, there's a lot of talent in this organization.
The thing I think that they have to figure out, as you noted, McClain hasn't played at all this year, and Encarnacion-Strand's barely played. So those are two guys they're getting back you would expect for next year. I do think that they have to figure out, okay, what is our outfield? What is, who are the guys that are our guys, as opposed to who are the guys who are useful until you get your guys, right? Like, I say that because I do think when it's all said and done, the combination of Steer, Fairchild, Fraley, Benson, Friedel, that's, you want another thumper out there at some point. You want another. Their outfield production, I would say, has been well below average, and that's kind of not a shock, because there are a lot of. I like TJ Friedel. I think that TJ Friedel is kind of like a fringe starter, or a very good fourth outfielder, like role player type, where you pick his spots for him. Maybe he's better than that. Maybe I'm selling him short. I feel like Will Benson kind of fits in that role too. They've had to give Benson probably more at bats this year than ideal, because they had a lot of injuries out there. Like, can they figure out the outfield? Because a lot of their guys coming up aren't really necessarily outfielders. I do think, and this is the one I'll kind of, we've had this debate, we've had this discussion. I'll kind of put you on the spot for it and then weigh in on my end. But when we talk about this, like, we go back and forth, like, they have Sal Stewart and Cam Collier who've kind of been coming up at the same level all the way up. And I still go back and forth. I'm probably think that Sal Stewart has a little bit clearer path than Collier. I think both of them kind of are. There are things to really like, and there are things to have concerns. We saw Collier obviously at the Futures game. He's been a prominent prospect for years. But kind of those are two of their better position player prospects. How do you kind of weigh those against each other?
Yeah, I think that's a tough call, because they're both very similar from the standpoint of being sort of positionless mashers or hitters, I guess you could say. I don't know if, they hit the ball hard, but they're also not like 30 home run bats at this point, right? Like, Stewart's a little bit more of a hit tool leaning profile on that. I think the plate skills overall are better than what we've seen so far from Collier. just in terms of he runs really high walk rates. He doesn't strike out. There is some power in the profile, but he doesn't sell out for it. Collier's walked a little bit more this year, but there's a little bit more swing and miss, a little bit more of approach concerns at times. He's hit for more power, just over the fence home run type of power, but is not as consistent of a hitter as Stewart is. So I think when we're comparing guys that we both think probably end up first base DH types, just based on the body and how they move, I don't think Collier's going to stick at third base. And I don't think Stewart's going to play third or second base in the big leagues. I lean on the guy that has the foundational hit tool skills that I just think are a little bit better. But the thing that you always have to factor into this equation with Collier is how young he is, how he's like a year ahead of everything, just because he reclassified as a high school junior, graduated from high school, then went the JUCO route, and then got drafted. He's done everything kind of accelerated that you wonder once it sort of catches up, if some of the power, everything else starts to play up a little bit more. You can't write that off. They're really close. I understand why you would lean Stewart over Collier.
I do want to kind of just highlight a couple other guys. Sammy Stafura's had a very solid year this year. Started in the complex, then gone on to the Florida State League. Adam Serwanowski, when we talk about these young guys who kind of are popping a little bit, he's, I would say, at least going to be a power lefty arm out of the pen. And then Shenning Lin, who was a two-way guy when when the Reds signed him, and they're still kind of seeing if he's a two-way guy. He played as a shortstop, third baseman for the complex league season, but now that the complex league season's over, they're letting him pitch in. I'm still going to call it the Arizona Tricky League, although they call it the Bridge League, but I just think Tricky League's a lot better name of it. But so they're still trying both for him. As you mentioned, Maxwell, Luis May is another guy who throws as hard as pretty much almost anyone in baseball. You put all this together, there's a lot of depth here, and especially as rough as the 24 season has been at the minor league level, if Ty Floyd comes back fully healthy next year, Hunter Holland comes back fully healthy, Edwin Arroyo comes back fully healthy, if some of those guys come back fully healthy, Alfredo Duno gets 350, 400 plate appearances, your first full year of Burns, Louder probably is ready for the big leagues next year. He's had really a good second half of the season, kind of had some adjustment level, troubles to AA, but been really good second half season. There's a lot to kind of still like here. And I do think if you look at, like you said, they don't have a whole lot that they have the ability to probably package some guys. What I think that they do need to do is it would be really useful for them to add one even middle tier outfielder, like someone who you can comfortably say, whether that's packaging in a trade or what, but to just give an example, and again, they're not shopping in the Teoscar Hernandez free agency world very much. Like, that's not what the Reds do, but you see what Teoscar Hernandez has done for the Dodgers this year. A guy like that would just make such a massive difference for this Reds team, because they're good on the infield. They're going to figure out enough. They've got enough infielders to figure it out. They've got you have your lineup is already deeper when you have a guy who's playing shortstop at a high level, who can steal you 80 bags and, by the way, hit 30 homers. And that's the middle of your order guy, switch hitter, who's, by the way, gotten better as a switch hitter this year in Elly De La Cruz. It gives you some freedom on that. But I just would love to see them have one, 280, 25 homer type guy in that outfield to go with all of this. But it does feel like, again, the trend line, I would say, here is trending up, even though I'm sure that there are Reds fans who look at last year and this year and say this doesn't feel in any way like a trend in the right direction. But they're on that cusp of an 80 type win team, and they don't need much to happen to go from that to being an 85 to 90 win team, which all of a sudden puts you right in the playoffs next year. So we'll see with that. That leads us to the team that is in the playoff hunt every year from the NL Central, to their credit, because they're not a large market team. So, Jeff, the Brewers, I would say, without a doubt, are the best run organization in this division. If you look at what they've done year in, year out, the way that they have continually rebuilt, but at the same time done so while never really having that awful season like most of the other teams in this division have had it at some point or another. Cardinals fans can now say they've had to endure that, because last year was not particularly fun. But what is it when you look at this Brewers team at the big league level, for one, like, is this a team that you think could win it all this year? And then, is the window starting to close, or do you feel like the window is going to be open for quite a while to come?
I think just the way that they manage the organization, it's kind of tough. And how well they identify and develop, particularly pitching. They could trade Corbin Burns and then run away at this point with the NL Central, right? With some teams that do spend money, I think some of them on the upswing. But you look at this team, and I think you can say, all right, they consistently sort of reinforce the roster when they need to. They have core players under contract for a few more years. They've been able to move guys like Burns, guys like Josh Hader, and not skip a beat. And then you look down in the farm system, and it seems like every single year we have 2 or 3 pitchers who come from unheralded backgrounds that take big steps forward. And we've seen that for the better part of a decade at this point. I think even Misiorowski, who was drafted a little bit higher, I don't think we ever expected him to be a top 50 prospect. Brett Wintrowski, when I saw him on the Cape, was sitting low 90s prior to the draft. Was not a huge name at Bryant. He's turned into an interesting prospect. And then Casey Hunt, who I wrote about last week, is a name that it wouldn't shock me if he moves up these rankings in the offseason. He's in AA, shoved in his first start, was a reliever his entire collegiate career. And now they move him to a starter in June, and he's gone in this run in high A and now AA, where it seems like it's 5 to 6 innings, 0 runs, 1 run, maybe 2, strikes out a bunch of batters, only walks 1 or 2, doesn't give up a ton of hits. He's got a great breaking ball. They've leaned into that. It's just they do stuff like that better than anybody else. I would even argue, I know that they haven't had the high draft investment on pitchers that the Mariners have, and the Mariners certainly have the best homegrown rotation. I think we're going to argue about that. They consistently turn picks all throughout the draft into interesting pieces, or they acquire them from other organizations and turn them into starters. So from a development standpoint, I think you can argue this might be the best pitching development in the league, and they've always hit enough. I don't know if they've, you would say it's a standout offense, but 1 through 9, it's a pretty good lineup, save maybe Jake Bauers, who they platoon. But you're looking at a pretty young team with some standout future stars, current stars. And it's the kind of lineup that's going to be tough in a playoff series because they're just going to keep coming at you. There's not really very many holes. And even Jake Bauers takes a lot of pitches, gets on base, can work a count. And that's your 8 hitter. And then in terms of rotation, do they have the deep stars they had before when it was Woodruff, Burns, Peralta? No. But they've gotten really good seasons out of Colin Ray. They've got a really good season out of Tobias Myers, who looks like maybe a future rotation piece here. Freddie Peralta's still there. They got back DL Hall. They added Montes as well as Savali this season via trades from Cincinnati and Tampa. And they have a good bullpen, and they've always sort of been pretty productive there. So I think it's a really interesting mix. I don't know if they have enough firepower to win it all. But to win a playoff series and make some noise and, make some people a little nervous, I think they have the ability to do that. And then you look at some of the reinforcements they could bring up over the next couple of years. They have some, they have a handful of really good players and then that are close to the majors, and guys like Cuero, who didn't play this year because of an injury, Misiorowski, who's now in AAA, Tyler Black, who we've seen at the major league level. And then this cache of young, interesting players in Cooper Pratt, Eric Bentoni, Jesus Mate. There's a lot of interesting players in this system, all the way down. And it seems like every single year you can set your watch. Okay, check on some Brewers prospects in the complex in mid-June. You're probably going to find a couple of standouts that are going to be prospects. Check out whatever pitchers they drafted last year. There's probably a couple of guys that are going to make a big step forward, whether that's as a reliever or, as a starter, like a guy like Craig Yoho, has one of the more interesting changeups in the minors, and he's probably
Best
going to
strikeout
be a
rate in
reliever
the
long
minors.
term. Yeah, but a guy that you didn't pay a lot of draft capital for him. I think the bonus was really low, and now this guy could turn into a bullpen piece for you for 4 or 5 years. They just get the most out of the players that they bring into the organization. I think it's a similar conversation to what we have with Seattle. They're just a little bit less aggressive in free agency and on the trade market.
So I would say on the trade front, though, the thing that jumps out, you mentioned about the Corbin Burnes trade. The thing that often derails teams is when you make moves like that, you don't have to win the trade. You have to not really lose it, right? If you trade Corbin Burnes away and you look back and you say, we didn't really get much of anything back for him, then you're in trouble. But Joey Ortiz is a productive regular for them as a rookie. Probably will keep getting better. Could really be their long-term answer at shortstop, potentially if they need him to, with Adames getting older and closer to free agency and all. But like speaking of Adames was an aggressive trade years ago that, hey, they did it and it really paid off for them. William Contreras, they just kind of inserted themselves into a trade there and won the trade because Contreras has ended up being one of their kind of foundational pieces. Then they get Bryce Terang has had a breakout season. That's a great draft pick. You talk about Churio. You talk about guys like Frelick, who's shown some versatility. Tobias Myers is free talent in essence. They've survived. We really like Robert Gasser, who came up for them and then got hurt. But they just do this in so many ways without ever spending a ton in free agency. They figure out ways to just kind of keep this going. And you look at it now, and like if you looked at this team 2 years ago and you said, how are they going to keep this going? You would say, well, they're going to have to find some rotation pieces. They're going to have to figure out some young guys, to make it work. And that was kind of 2 years ago, would be really at the start of the rise of Churio. And here you are now. You go, okay, well, a team has Ortiz, Churio, and then throw in guys around it like Frelick, and if he can ever be healthy, Garrett Mitchell, Contreras, who's not even 20, he's still right in the middle of his peak. This is a team that has a lineup to kind of feel very good about going forward. And then, like you said, I think we both really like Cooper Pratt and what Cooper Pratt can be. Like, he's the kind of prospect right now where if you want to nitpick him, you can nitpick, okay, is he going to be a shortstop long term? I think he's got a chance to, but he's definitely going to play somewhere in the dirt and be valuable in the dirt. I think he has kind of that internal clock, that baseball IQ that makes everything play really well defensively. He's not hitting it for a ton of power right now. We both talked to him at the prospect pad before the Futures game. That's really not his approach right now. He wants to hit, and then he'll get to power. And I did love talking to him. He's like, I said, so when's the first time you really saw top end velo? He's like, oh, I've been hitting off that since on the pitching machine since I was 12. His dad always kind of emphasized to him, if we make practice really tough, the games will be a lot easier. So they would dial the pitching machines up to far beyond anything he'd ever see in high school. And okay, so by the time he got to pro ball, it wasn't a shock to see this because he'd already been dealing with this. You talk about breakouts like, we didn't mention Mike Bovee, but that's another interesting bat. This is an organization that clearly emphasizes guys who can hit and then wants to see if the power develops. Frelick kind of fits in that, when they drafted him as well. Bryce Terang fits in that when you draft him as well. And I think just you look at it all together and it all fits together really well. This is the class of the division. It's been the class of the division. And for all there's really not a team in this team in this division where you go, oh, they have no hope of being good. But I still look at all of them and say, I'm going to stay skeptical that anyone can surpass the Brewers in the next couple of years, just because the Brewers have earned that in my mind. The Brewers have done this enough where I don't have the same questions about them, where we have this on some of these others. Like, that kind of segues us to the Pirates, where I do feel like that this year, Pirates fans, understandably, there's a lot of overlap there because I follow the Steelers very closely as my NFL team. And so I have a lot of Steelers writers / Steelers fans in my feed that are also Pirates fans. And there's been some frustration, I feel like, this year, understandably, like that this team is still kind of probably not going to the postseason this year. But you look at what they've done, and I do think that they're probably a Jared Jones injury away from. That's probably what, when we look back on it, say what kind of derailed them is they had a two-headed monster at the top of the rotation. Then Jones got hurt, and so that kind of left them. Nothing against Mitch Keller, like this is still a good rotation, but when you had Skeens and Jones together, you kind of had 2 out of every 5 games where you're like, okay, we've got a really good chance of winning these. And where do you kind of see them now? It's kind of tailed off. The end kind of came, I would say, this as we're recording this past week, where they pretty much they went from being a 500 team to being an under 500 team, and they were 2 games over 500. Just a week and a half ago, and now they're well under 500. But is this a team with rays of hope? Are we being too optimistic, or what do they need to do, Geoff? I would say it's probably the best question to ask you. What do they need to do so that 2025 is not another disappointing year like many years have been for the Pirates so far?
I think they have to figure out the offense, and that's not something they've been able to figure out at the minor league level either. Just in terms of developing potential impact or above average regulars positionally. Pitching wise, I think you look at this rotation, the way that they slot in next year with Skeens, with Jones, with Keller, with Bailey Falter, who's been a pretty good acquisition, has pitched well for them at points in time. Louis Ortiz, who's kind of coming back down to earth now, but pitched really well for a good chunk of the season. And then you have names like Bubba Chandler, who's now in AAA, some of the best stuff in the minor leagues. He's taken a big step forward just in terms of projecting as a starter. Braxton Ashcraft, who's injured again, but had showed pretty well. Thomas Harrington, who's a guy that's, I think, on the cusp or just about to be added to our top 100 list. He's shown a lot of upside and, the ability to navigate a lineup and execute on a consistent basis, which is kind of the last piece. And they have, a bunch of other pitching prospects they've added over the last few drafts that are interesting in a variety of different ways. So I think from a pitching standpoint, you can look at this and say, oh yeah, the future is bright. They have a rotation and they have maybe 6 or 7 starters that could all be contributing to the major leagues in May or June. I don't think some of these other guys like Harrington, Chandler, et cetera, or Ashcraft when healthy are all that far off. And then they have, one of the more enviable 1-2 punches at the top of that rotation in Paul Skeens and then Jared Jones, 22 and 23 years old, respectively. Jones will be back in the rotation probably this weekend or early next week. He did his first rehab start, I think yesterday or Saturday. So you kind of look at that and you say, all right, like they have the hardest piece. It's hard to find really good pitching. Now what they have to do is they have to go out into the free agent market. They have to add some pieces around Brian Reynolds and O'Neal Cruz. You'll have, Andy Rodriguez back next year. We'll see what he does. Cabrian Hayes is fine. But I think, finding.
I mean, you need a little bit more from the bat for Brian Hayes. Let's just be clear.
Sure. But I think if that's like your 8 hitter and he's a defensive player, fine. But they need to go out there. They got to get a Kyle Schwarber. They have to get, one of those pieces that takes that lineup and all of a sudden you're like, okay, there's 4 or 5 guys here to be scared of that can do something besides 1 or 2. I mean, because if Elly De La Cruz isn't in this division, the conversation that we had at the top of the show about Elly De La Cruz being one of the most exciting players in baseball, we'd be having that conversation about O'Neal Cruz because he's not that far off. Not quite there, but a really exciting player, a guy that can change a game on its face in a matter of a swing. But they need to have more in this lineup that scares you. A 38-year-old Andrew McCutchen shouldn't be your leadoff hitter at this point. Joey Bart's been a nice story, but still I think there's some questions there. And then you're looking at guys like that are kind of off the scrap heap, Rowdy Tellez, Isaiah Falafa, like nice player to have. Probably don't want that guy starting every day if you think you're going to make a long playoff push. Brian De La Cruz, not a bad acquisition, helps him here, but not really anything all that exciting. Michael A. Taylor,
they're shopping the bargain aisle.
Yeah, these are better bench players, part-time regular types, depth types than guys that should be starting. And I think you look at the other lineups and just in this division, and there's a lot more to be excited about with the Brewers. Even with the Cardinals at this point, though they've underproduced for a couple of years now, the Cubs, the Reds, that's what they're up against. They have the pitching. Now they need to go out and they need to sign hitters. And I think if they're aggressive enough, and that's a big question with the Pirates, in free agency, position players like this, veteran position players, can be had on 2-3 year deals that aren't going to kill you. They're not going to kill the future. They can reinforce this. I think the path is there. It's a matter of whether ownership commits to that, the front office commits to that, and they're given the go-ahead, the green light to go and spend a little bit of money. They don't have to go crazy here, but I think they could shop in that second tier of free agents, and they could reinforce this lineup with, a little bit more depth in terms of opposing pitchers are game planning, and they don't have to worry about just pitching around two guys. And that's kind of the way it's been with this team for a while.
So I feel like I've probably talked to Pirates fans more about Tamar Johnson this year than I've talked to any fan base about any player. And what it comes down to is, there's some frustration like, hey, you guys don't have him in the top 100. Why do you not have him in the top 100? And I'll start and then kind of kick this to you. The best answer we have is when we talk to scouts pretty regularly. I've probably talked to 5-6 scouts about Tamar Johnson this year who've seen him this year at different times, even though I don't have the Pirates. Like, this is something where I just find him a very interesting player. And the best way I could put it is the reports we get back are not that he's, this is, what were they doing? This is a terrible player or anything like that. But it's just not, this is a impact big leaguer down the road. Like, the questions are defensively, where is he going to play? And then offensively, he's not. And again, I say this as someone who thought that Tamar Johnson, when I saw him in high school, I thought he was one of the best high school bats I've seen in a long time. I remember just being wowed and talked to a lot of scouts. I think you have too, who kind of described him that way when he was in high school. That's not what we're seeing. Like, a really good July, unfortunately August, and kind of a dip back. I mean, it's kind of, he may not be at his true talent level's not what he was in July. That was a really hot streak. His true talent level's not as bad as he's been in August so far. He's better than that. It's not that Tamar Johnson's not an interesting prospect, but the best way I could put it is he's kind of on a Nick Gonzalez type path. This is for the guys in the same organization. Like, Nick Gonzalez kind of was that 2020 draft, so it's a little weird, but he was top, a top pick, is considered one of the most polished hitters in that class, goes out and the professional production kind of hasn't matched that. This year's been kind of a consolidation year. He's kind of shown some things again at the big league level where it's kind of shown some encouragement. But if you look at where Nick Gonzalez is now, you say, okay, with the defensive limitations and all, this is probably more of a complementary player than a kind of cornerstone type player. Tamar Johnson's young enough that hopefully that's not the case with him, but that's a lot of what we get. We get a lot of, I would say, this guy could be a 5, could be a solid regular, could be a 4 if the bat doesn't really kind of take another step forward, but you don't really get a lot of this guy could be a 6, because for Tamar Johnson to be a 6, you either need the hit tool to be a 6 or, a 6 with 55-6 power, or you need the hit tool to be a 7 with 50 power. And it's kind of, we're just not getting a lot of that. That's what my sense is. But I wonder kind of, because he's a player who's been, I think, on the minds of a lot of Pirates fans, what's your perception? What are you hearing?
Yeah, I think, it's similar. You don't get a lot of great reports now on the pro side from Tamar Johnson. I think that, there might be certain analysts that like the fact that he does hit the ball hard. He doesn't chase a ton. But the balance of hit tool and power, which is why this guy went as high as he did in the draft, just hasn't been present. He's been more of a 3 true outcome type of hitter. He's passive, and then there's a lot of swing and miss in zone. And he doesn't have loud tools to fall back on. He doesn't have, a ton of speed. He's not super rangy. He's not a guy that can play multiple positions in the infield. It's kind of second base, and I guess maybe there's a chance he could get stuck in left field or something at this point. So he really needs to hit. When you have that kind of profile, you're up against a lot of players that maybe weren't drafted as high, but were drafted because of their offensive prowess. And you kind of got to meet that bar. It's not all that different from being a first baseman DH type. He hasn't done that. You know, I don't know what happened between getting drafted and now, but it seems like we've not just knocked the hit tool down a full grade. It's 2, maybe even 3. People thought this guy was a 60, maybe even a 70 hit. It's looking more like a 40 to maybe even a 30 if you're just looking at pure contact. He does have decent approach. It just hasn't come all together. And on top of it, he's played a majority of his games the last 2 years in one of the friendlier ballparks in the minor leagues for home games. So you would expect him to put up big power numbers in that park, and it just hasn't clicked. And, you know, I think you look at a player like this and it's hard to put him on a top 100 list until he does start to produce, because there aren't tools to fall back on. You can look at a Kevin Alcantara with the Cubs and say, all right, like, he's struggling right now. He's 6'6", but he's a freaky athlete. He's got speed. He's a 6 in center. He's got huge exit velocities. Contact will come, right? You kind of can't do that with Tamar because he has to hit. For him to be a top prospect, he has to be productive with the bat. And I think that's the part that's been missing. And I like Tamar. I like the player. I like some of the underlying data I was even seeing as recently as last year. That's ticked back a little bit this year, and it's just not as exciting. The exit velocities aren't as high. It's like you have to wonder if I almost feel like he's a player that's caught between a couple of different identities, trying to be more like the hit tool guy that he was. And maybe that's just not who he is. Maybe he is more of that 3 true outcome type of hitter, but he's not the most physically imposing guy. There's not a ton of projection in that body. So you wonder how much power is still coming, you know, that it makes it harder to kind of overlook the warts. The warts look a little bit bigger with Tamar recently.
The thing I would say with that is that the other thing that kind of tie in with that is, and I will say with Greensboro, I do think it's better for right-handed hitters as far as it's more offensive for right-handed hitters. So he doesn't get all the benefit of Greensboro that, you know, he would if he was a right-handed bat. But I would say that that the other question I kind of have is I know people look at, this is the guy with a career like 395 on base percentage and go, see, that's what you're looking for. And then you say, okay, but he's a career sub 240 batting average. I do when you see that in a guy at A-ball, having a good eye, like that's, to me, that's one of those things that's a skill that as you climb the ladder is going to be harder to sustain, because you can absolutely, by being patient, rack up really high OBPs in A-ball nowadays. The pitching, you know, is you, especially when you was in the FSL, but the pitching will help you get there, right? Because some of these guys are just not going to throw strikes. And if so you're going to walk. But at some point, you don't get to that on base percentage at the big league level without either having big power or hitting for average that helps you get there. And that's the part that just hasn't happened yet for Tamar Johnson. Again, we hope it does. Like, this was a guy who was one of my favorite dudes coming out of high school. Really such a sweet bat, you know, and it just hasn't all come together yet. That, again, this does not mean this is the guy who we rank as their number 4 prospect. This isn't like, oh, the jury is out. Like, this is not, he's not going to be the big league or anything like that. It does mean, though, that this is a guy who we keep getting questions. Why is this guy not a top 100 prospect? And that's the answer is that when we talk to teams, when we talk to evaluators outside of the Pirates organization about Tamar Johnson, they don't perceive him that way right now. And so that's kind of where we are. And again, I use Nick Gonzalez just because Nick Gonzalez had a similar path here. Like, this is the part that the Pirates do have to improve. Like, they have not had a whole lot of success at developing hitters in recent years. And, you can throw Nick Gonzalez. They've had top picks. Henry Davis. They just haven't had a whole lot of guys who you're like, okay, That's the homegrown hitter success stories to build around. They've absolutely had that on the pitching side. Now they need to do that on the hitting side. And we'll see where that goes. Well, that leads us into the last team in the Central, which is another organization you do, that I would say that the Cardinals, Geoff, like they have kind of had a little bit of a definite step back at the big league level this last year. They've kind of taken a step back forward this year. Was last year a blip in your mind, or is it last year like a needed course correction, or where do you see them now for 2024, but especially for 25 and beyond?
Yeah, I think there's a few issues with this team. Number one, it's funny. They kind of have the opposite problem of the Pirates. If you'd taken the Pirates rotation and plopped it with this lineup, that's right. That's a team that could potentially win a World Series. Offensively, 1 through 9, they look pretty good. They have some other hitters in the top of this organization that could, maybe make a big jump forward. Jordan Walker, I think it's just a matter of like learning to elevate the ball consistently, because there's a lot of ingredients there as a hitter to turn into a very good hitter. It's just, we'll see what happens. It's kind of a different problem than Joe Adell, but very similar from the sense of a top prospect who came up early, didn't meet expectations, has spent, a chunk of this year in the minor leagues. But overall, you look at this lineup, and outside of Arenado, Goldschmidt, and Wilson Contreras, get my Contreras within the NL Central mixed up. Wilson Contreras, the older brother, it's all homegrown. Wynn, Burleson has had a great season this year, as is Mason Wynn. I mean, he's one of the hottest players of the last month. Brendan Donovan has, continued to be a very solid player. Lars Nootbaar is a solid player. Nolan Gorman, solid player. We'll see what happens with Victor Scott. He's showing a little bit more now in his second tour of duty with the major league team. I think positionally they've continued to develop prospects. Not all of them have hit, but it's an incredibly homegrown lineup from 1 through 9. Unfortunately for them, Arenado has lost bat speed. He looks like he's getting old. The underlying skill metrics, swing and miss rate, chase, all that stuff is as good as it's ever been or slightly better. And the power is way down. I know I was talking about this on a forthcoming 90th percentile podcast with Pajak, and Matt was kind of calling out Arenado as an example of someone who had below average athleticism, and the tools start to atrophy. And I think we're seeing that with his power. His average exit velocity is like 85 miles an hour this year. It's down significantly, and it's kind of ticked down over time. He's getting old. At this point, Paul Goldschmidt is fine, but he's 37 years old. They got a lot of money tied up in some of these guys. That's a bit of a question mark. I do think they still have enough depth in order to supplant that. The issue is the pitching staff. They're old at the major league level. They had to go out and sign, a cache of free agents this year. Sonny Gray, chief among them, has been really good. But they're old. I mean, the only guy that's under 32 next year that's in this rotation is Andre Palante, and I don't think he's probably going to stick in the rotation long term. A lot of the homegrown options haven't taken that big step forward. We haven't seen that for Matthew Libator. We haven't seen Michael McGreevy, who was a first round pick of theirs, really make a big jump forward and solidify himself as a part of that rotation. I don't think it's probably going to happen. Gordon Graceffo being another one. And they've had a down year from Tekoa Roby in the farm system. They have a couple of other arms right at the top that are pretty interesting. But it's a matter of figuring out pitching, which is something that the Cardinals seemed like they had pretty well figured out.
No one's better.
Starters. Yeah.
In the 2010s. No one better.
I mean, yeah, there was nobody better. And now it's like they're living off of this old reputation because they haven't been able to produce starters internally, which keeps the cost down. We know that they don't spend a ton of money, even though they probably could spend a little bit more. And that's always been a point of frustration covering this team and just hearing from different Cardinals fans and beat reporters, etc. So I think that's the big question mark. Can they develop some starters here who can be that next core of arms? They've put some draft capital into it. I mean, and if we talk about this system in the top 10, Tink Hence has been a top 100 prospect for a while. Quinn Matthews had a breakout season. He's jumped into the top 100, pitched well again yesterday. Tekoa Roby in the offseason had as much buzz from scouts post-trade as any player that I covered. I mean, I think we had him number 2 in the system. And that wasn't a me thing. I was talking to pitching coaches. I was talking to 2 or 3 out of the organization, opposing scouts that were like, no, this is a guy. He's got the ingredients to be something, but hasn't gotten better under their tutelage. Has always dealt with some injuries. Cooper Jerpy was a first-round pick back in 2022. He's had spurts. He shows some stuff in terms of getting swings and misses in the zone on all 3 of his primary pitches, but he hasn't really taken the step forward and kind of ascended up to the major leagues at this point, which I think coming out of the draft, we sort of felt like this is a guy that should move pretty fast. Gordon Graceffo is another one who just made his major league debut shortly, not too long ago. And he was a guy that the stuff coming out of spring training in 2023 was super loud. He hit 100. I think people were pretty excited for what he could potentially turn into. And it hasn't followed that course. Stuff has ticked down a little bit. He hasn't developed as well as they wanted him to. So I think that's the biggest question mark kind of clouding the future of the Cardinals is how are they going to develop pitching going forward? Because it hasn't been good, and it hasn't been good almost across the board. Tink Hence took some steps forward the last 2 years in terms of getting deeper into games. He's slight. Tink isn't just a name, it's a lifestyle. And he's just not built like a starting pitcher. And I think that that's kind of a major question mark of this is a really good pitching prospect. The ingredients are there, but can he put it all together and give you 150 innings plus year after year? I don't know if he can.
The thing I would say with that this year has not been, I know he's kind of battled some little nagging injuries, but since the start of June, June 5th, he threw 2 innings, June 23rd, he threw an inning, July 27th, he threw 1 2/3, August 2nd, he threw 2 2/3, and then August 8th, he finally threw 1 2/3. This year doesn't get him closer to being able to do that for them at the big league level next year, unfortunately. It's kind of left him at that same spot where you look at it and say, okay, I hope he gets there, but it's still a concern, and it probably will remain a concern at least going into 25, where now you got to say, okay, the first year that you can really feel comfortable that he's just a part of your rotation and let's just let him go is 26 at this point, because next year will probably have to be an innings limited, let's see when he's ready kind of year still, right?
Yeah, and I think that's the problem is he showed the innings last year. There were some, parts of the stuff that still needed to improve. The first half of the season, it very much felt like we were on the pathway for him putting it all together, getting deeper into games, handling innings, holding his stuff, showing a quality breaking ball, a quality fastball, and a quality changeup from start to start. He didn't do that a lot last year. He was much more changeup heavy, where it had been the breaking ball the previous year that was his best secondary. He's always had good fastball traits, so that's not a question. But now we're looking at another year, and he's still fairly young, but we're looking at another year where it's like he's going to have to build up again. That it almost feels like the ETA of him being a part of this rotation and making 25 starts for the Cardinals and going 5 to 6 innings every time out seems a little bit further away. It seems like that's probably more likely to be 2026 if everything comes together in 2025. Stranger things have happened, but with the type of pitcher he is and just the riskiness of pitchers, and I think we've seen it so frequently from pitching prospects, when teams start to handle guys like this, it's usually a bad sign. It's a bad sign that there's a lingering injury that they're trying to sort of nurse through. We saw that with Ricky Tiedemann. And more often than not, these guys end up on the operating table having to have some sort of procedure, whether that's full Tommy John surgery, whether it's internal brace, whether it's a shoulder issue. You don't want that for Tink because he's so exciting and the Cardinals really need this. But I think if you're a betting man and somebody like us that has to rank prospects, there's a little bit more risk in this profile than you might have thought there was in May, where it looked like, all right, maybe this guy is becoming a 55 high and not, a 55 extreme or whatever you want to put the grade on.
I think 60.
That's the toughest part.
Because again,
he could be a 60.
If durability is not an issue, he's a 6.
Yeah, I think so.
No. Now, okay, so that to kind of wrap this up, let's bring it to the other one, which is now Quinn Matthews has had the year where he came into the year and there were concerns about that. He had a very heavy workload at Stanford and had kind of been held back because of that. I do think, like, if I'm a Cardinals fan and I say, what's the biggest sign of hope besides the fact that you got JJ Weatherholt in the first round? Thumbs up.
It was a good draft overall. I think they did well.
Yeah, good draft overall. But besides that, I would say that the emergence of Matthews, who, by the way, is showing the workload to where if you said, is this guy going to be part of your rotation next year? I would say, yeah. And on top of that, I would say you can probably feel pretty good about the possibility that he's going to be kind of a no training wheels type starter. He's already at 112 innings right now. I don't know what his number is going to end up being, but it's going to be north of 120. And if you're north of 120 in a minor league season, you're then going to be you're going to be positioned in a scenario that if you stay healthy, you can give a team 140, 150 innings in a rotation. Well, that's good. That's nowadays in 2025, that will be like thumbs up. Great. Please do that for us.
And I mean, he threw 124 innings at Stanford last year. I don't think that includes the playoffs either, where, the tournament where he had.
It does count the tournament.
It does count the tournament. All right.
College postseason counts.
Okay. I wasn't sure if that was on Baseball Ref where I was looking. I'm never sure how they factor that in or not. And then, was close to 100 innings the previous year. He's handled it. He's also a bigger guy, at 6'5", much more of a mature body type. I mean, he's going to be 24 in October. 4-year college guy, knows how to pitch, and then added the stuff. I think that's the biggest thing is he's added significant velocity across his pitch mix. And that was always kind of the biggest question. He had shapes. He knew how, the pitchability was high. He knew how to get through a lineup 2 to 3 times. He can show you different looks. Left-handed, now with power, gets deep into games, starters build. I think it's pretty easy to project him as a starter, and he's going to be 24 years old because he was a senior sign. He's a guy that you can shove right up to the major leagues next year. I don't think that's crazy. If he comes into camp and looks good and stays healthy, there's a chance that he's part of this rotation. If not opening day, by like mid-May, that wouldn't shock me. It wouldn't shock me if he even gets some starts down the stretch, maybe 1 or 2 at the end of the season. He hasn't seen AAA yet, but continues to pitch well at higher levels. Now over 7 starts at AA. He's got a 3.11 ERA, backed by a 2.97 FIP and a 3.33 xFIP, and he's striking out a ton of batters as well. It's ticked down at each level, but you would expect this guy with the stuff he has, left-handed pitchability, to have 40+% K rates in low A, 35% type of K rates in high A. Now he's in AA in a tough place to pitch in the Texas League, and he's got, for all intents and purposes, 29.9%, but it's a 30% K rate with a lower walk rate. Doesn't have a homer issue. He's never allowed more than, over the course of his professional career, which is this year, he's never averaged a half a home run per 9 innings. So he keeps the ball in the ballpark on top of it. Not a ground ball guy, but can get it when he needs it. And I think this is the best story outside of landing JJ Weatherholt, who could turn out to be the best of this group of college hitters that were in this draft class.
The best way I could put it is if Matthews can be a 3/4 for them, which I think is not a crazy idea, that would be huge for them because they need some homegrown guys like that. I don't think I'm not expecting him to be a 2 or an ace or anything like that, but they don't need, that's okay. Like, again, we've been saying this I feel like I'm saying this on the podcast now for 17 years. It's like everyone feels like that we're damning a pitcher when we say it might be a number 3 and he might be a number 4. Like, please, teams out there right now are saying, my kingdom for a number 4. Like, I look at the Twins calling up Zebby Matthews. They don't need Zebby Matthews to come up to be a 1. They need Zebby Matthews to come up and be a 5. If he could be a 5 for them the rest of the year, that would be a huge addition and develops into a 4. That would be a massive success story.
Provide quality starts, right? And it's just one more game where your bullpen isn't as taxed. One more game where you stay in it a little bit longer, even when the runs and the offense isn't producing. That's how you win in the major leagues long term, is accumulating those innings over the long haul, taking the pressure off your bullpen, sometimes taking the pressure off the bats, and just providing quality starts. And I think that's what a guy like Quinn Matthews can do for them.
That's the perfect way to end it. I would say that we probably should add a how many innings are expected out of a guy component to when we describe starters now. Like, one of the big differences between like a 3 and a 5 beyond ERA, FIP, things like that, number of pitches and all that. But really it is kind of like if you look at, speaking of Twins, if you look at David Festa's been up and down in his starts, but the main reason he's a 5/6 right now is he's a 3 to 5. Like if you get 5 innings out of him, you feel like you've had a win, right? Guys who you aren't comfortable getting 15 outs are not the same as guys who you're comfortable getting 18 outs. 18 outs is great. 21 outs, woohoo! 21 outs regularly, throw a party, because that does mean that your bullpen had a much better night. But man, really going on this one. This one, we've clocked in at over an hour here. We hope that you really enjoyed it. Again, if you've enjoyed this one, we have even if you are a fan of an NL Central team, if you want to be more informed about all the teams out there, this is our 5th of 6 of these. We hope you're really enjoying them. If you are, please like and subscribe on whatever your podcast of choice. If you leave us a review, if you would, especially a 5-star review, helps other people find us on Apple, especially on that. But also, if you're on YouTube, subscribe to us on YouTube, leave a comment, leave a like, things like that. If you're seeing these on YouTube and you want more of these, that helps other people see them, which kind of just feeds the algorithm. That's the world we live on in 2024. But as always, we want to thank our Baseball America subscribers, because the subscribers are what allows us to do this. There's a lot of great stuff up at Baseball America this week, including FCL and ACL top 20 prospect lists. So speaking of these teams that we're talking about, there's some names there that you might not know as much about that we've got reports on at baseballamerica.com. For Jeff, I'm JJ. So long, everybody.